Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie back with another episode of Red Power Hour, joined here by two wonderful Red Nation comrades, including a comrade who is coming to the podcast for the very first time. So I'm super excited about that. So I'll let them introduce themselves, and I'll start with you, Elena, and then we'll go to you, Rochelle.
Hi, it's Elena Ortiz calling in from Ogopoge Owinge. We're really excited to have Rochelle here on this podcast. So I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi there, my name is Rochelle, and I'm really honored to be on with Melanie and Elena. Pretty heavy topic today, but I think we have a really nice, well-rounded kind of take on some of the emotional impacts, and yeah. But I'm really grateful to be on with you all. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into it, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have an ongoing GoFundMe fundraiser campaign for Red Media. This has been going on since what used to be Indigenous Heritage Month, which I'm pretty sure has now been outlawed in the Trump administration, but basically since November. Our target is $30,000, currently at $13,126, and our goal by the end of February. So wait, February is not 7 days, 5 days. That's 5 days from now. We're hoping to get to $15,000. So please, if you have not donated yet, please go to the GoFundMe. The link to that will be included in the release for this episode. Or if you know anyone else who has some spare cash around to donate to us, we'd really appreciate it. As always, you can become a patron and join us on Patreon, patreon.com/Red Media Paper or PAPR. You can find us where Red Media and the podcast are 100% listener funded. And again, the money that we get from donations goes towards paying, our young working class staff who help to produce the podcast on the back end, and allowing us to continue to do this work. So thank you so much to all of our supporters. And again, if you would like to join our Patreon for as little as $2 a month, please go to patreon.com/Red Media Paper. So now that that's out of the way, let's get to our topic at hand. As Rochelle said, we have a really heavy, difficult topic today. We're going to be talking about the legacy of residential and boarding schools, essentially child removal, the larger history of child removal. And we're going to do a review today. So this is another RPH episode. Many of you are probably familiar with the reviews we do, podcasts, films, TV shows, all kinds of things. Sometimes we do books, but today we're going to be reviewing the documentary Sugarcane. I'm sure some of you have watched it. The movie came out, or it's a documentary, not the movie. It came out last year. I believe its official release was in October 2024. But my understanding actually from Rochelle is that it was kind of making the film festival circuit earlier than that in 2024. And I became very interested in this documentary right around the time that it came out because I teach our Intro to American Indian and Indigenous Peoples course in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. And I actually wanted to screen this for my students because it just seemed I do a whole section on child removal because that's pretty important for an intro class. And I did not have access to it at that time, but I was told by a student at the end of last semester that it was finally available on Disney Plus because it was released through National Geographic, is my understanding. And you can watch National Geographic content on Disney Plus. So I did class. I'm teaching that same class this semester about a month and a half ago. I haven't watched it since then because I could not actually bring myself to watch it a second time because it was so difficult to watch the first time. And we'll get into that. But the reason why I'm giving this backstory a little bit is because I have been interested in watching and sharing and talking about this documentary for several months and was really like, I don't know if you can't use the word joy in association with the content of this particular documentary, but I guess I was not surprised when I learned a couple of weeks ago that it was nominated for an Oscar. And is the category like feature-length documentary or long-form documentary? I forgot what the actual category is. But I was like, I knew even last fall that this was going to be a groundbreaking documentary, not just about residential and boarding schools, but about like 20th and 21st century Native history in Turtle Island. And so, yes, it is up for an Oscar. Many people may or may not know that. I would encourage everyone to go and watch this documentary. Be prepared mentally and emotionally for some really, really difficult, gut-wrenching, heartbreaking, soul-crushing content, to be honest. That would just be my disclaimer. I didn't know that going into it. I had to stop it 6 times as I was watching it, and I wept probably like for about half of the documentary. So intense. I'll be screening this for my students on Wednesday in my class, and I've also given them a disclaimer and a warning about that. But yeah, I just wanted to give that little bit of background here. And I wanted to open it up to Elena and Rochelle. We can start wherever you would like. Maybe your initial responses to the documentary, and then we can go from there to kind of cover all the bases that we're hoping to talk about today.
Yeah, I had a very similar reaction to it when I watched it, and it's really, really difficult to watch at one time. I actually stopped it a couple of times and went back. I rewound it and watched some things so that I was clear on it. And I was, besides crying, sobbing through parts of it, there were parts of it where I was really proud of this community at Williams Lake and how incredibly brave they were. And the women in particular, Julian and Ed Noisecat, were incredible in it. But the women from the very beginning who were, they had their board with their yarn on it and marking the graveyards, the unmarked graveyards, and just their determination to see that the truth was brought to light. And I think it is at the end, through all the difficult moments, I felt like these people shone a light on something that has been kept in the darkness for so long. And even with Kamloops and the bodies that really, brought all of this into to the attention of the world, and the Pope's apology, which was sort of an apology, and Justin Trudeau, who is just whatever, his apology. The real meaning of this was a community coming together and saying apologies are not enough.
Yeah, I was really taken by how this is kind of like a really beautiful first full circle moment that happened with the making of this film, how Julian was able to kind of recognize his place in history and his place in the lineage of his family and the things that have happened to them and what has carried on, has been passed down from those things. And to take up this moment in 2024 and kind of follow the entire journey of when they're uncovering the graves to the individuals in his community and his direct family that are impacted. There's never been anything made like this. We've always heard a lot of research in retrospect, which has been powerful and important and has paved the way for someone like Julian to do this. And I just think that also the film was aesthetically very beautiful. Like there was all these long moments where you're just driving through the community and the landscape. And I think there's a lot of sinking into moments where there'll be a line that is said or a sentiment that is shared or a song or a visual, and it kind of hangs out there for a while. And you don't get that experience in reading, reports or listening to podcasts so much, but the experience of this film is something that adds another layer of it's almost like especially because it's happening in real time, it's following these elders, like Melanie was saying earlier, to the Vatican and to the process of doing the report, doing the actual research. And I think all those layers of being in the experience with them, and then when different news gets delivered. We're talking with them at the beginning of the film, then they uncover certain things, and I think that's a really special aspect of this film, is how beautiful it is. So just some initial thoughts about just like at large.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just I forgot to say that the documentary is co-directed by Julian Brave Noisecat, who is from the community Williams Lake. That is the focus of the documentary, and the residential school, the Catholic run. There's a difference between Catholic run residential schools and other government run residential schools. The Canadian government would often pay the Catholic Church to run residential schools on its behalf, so it would contract with them. And so focus documentaries a Catholic boarding school or residential school, sorry. So it's co-directed by Julian Brave Noisecat, who's a quite well-known Indigenous journalist, mostly based out of the United States. Of course, this takes place on the other side of the medicine line in Canada, and another filmmaker named Emily Cassie. Rochelle, I know that you went to a screening of the documentary with both of them, and so you knew a little bit more about their relationship with each other. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we got the facts about the documentary correct for everyone in case they need to look it up or just know who was behind this. But Rochelle, did you want to share a little bit more about what they said about how this documentary came into existence and how actually Julian and his I've met Julian many times. Like I shared an Airbnb with Julian at the NASA conference in El Tior in 2019. I'm not saying like I know Julian well at all, but Julian's like a well-known journalist and a lot of people are acquaintances with him. And so I could not believe that. I don't know how comfortable I would be having that, my family history, like the revelation about it in real time, it presented the entire world. And we're going to get into what that history is, but it is so heartbreaking and utterly shocking that I feel like I was getting to know Julian, but maybe in a way that wasn't appropriate almost. You get what I'm saying? So I was like very what's the word? I was extremely humbled by his like courage to share this story. Him and his father's courage to share their family's intimate story, like the remarkable like shame that must surround that story, and the truth of that. Like it was such an intimate portrait of his life and his history and his legacy. I think that was also one of the things that hit hardest about somebody like I know, kind of more professionally. But I just wanted to share that. Rochelle, I know that you went off mute, and I had asked you before I kind of went on about, because they shared about how they came to tell this story in the way that they did.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful aspect of it, is when Emily reached out to Julian about when they were starting to cover these unmarked graves, and he shared this in an interview that was after the screening in San Rafael, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to join a project like this right now, especially since it was so close to his family, and he took a couple weeks to think about it. And in the meantime, Emily happened to reach out to Williams Lake, not knowing that that's where Julian's family was from, and already got that project started. And so by the time he reached back out and said, "Okay, I'm down to do this," she said, "This is where I am, and this is what I'm doing." And it was just an amazing coincidence that it was his family. So he didn't set out, when he agreed to the project, to making a film about his family, and it just kind of ended up that way. And I think that that's why we get a lot of these wildly intimate and really authentic moments that come through, because it wasn't scripted or planned for that way. It just unfolded. So there's a really special element of it.
Yeah, it's almost like the journey that this film takes you on is being shared by everyone who is filming it and being talked to. There weren't really interviews in it. There was sharing. There was people sharing with one another and about very hard, difficult subjects, and not only what happened to them as children, but just understanding now as adults and elders the impact that it's had on subsequent generations, and having to own that, but also having to face it with their children, grandchildren standing right in front of them. Why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you do this? And there was no shame. There was no blame. There was no, transgenerational trauma has wrecked this family. It was all about just real emotion. And I felt like I was being taken along with them as they were having these realizations themselves. And that was super powerful. There was no, there was sort of no attempt at making this an emotional journey. There was no artifice. There was no attempt. It all just came out. And I don't know if non-Native people would feel the same way that Native people feel watching this film. But aside from crying and, at some points just, damn, the bravery of these people. Other times I just kind of nodded, like, I understand now. I understand my own family better. And and that was huge.
Yeah, so many threads what the both you just said to pull on. I think, what you said, Elena, that there was no artifice. And Rochelle, you used the word authentic, and authentic journey, sharing. Like that's, and then you're seeing these revelations and the impact of these revelations. And they're not even revelations. It's like people who are speaking the unspeakable for the very first time in 50, 60 years, right? And you're seeing the relationships, the intergenerational relationships in like Julian's family and some of these other families who are just on camera, right? Throughout the documentary, you're seeing them tell these stories sometimes for the first time, and they're doing it in front of a camera, which again is like incredibly brave and courageous. And I think it lends to the authenticity, but there is no, I'm an academic, and like what hear me do a lot is analyze things, right? I provide like an analysis for a story. Like I theorize from that story, come to kind of like understanding or framework about colonization or about decolonization or resurgence or something that I think that is politically important. And this documentary didn't do that. There wasn't an analysis. There was no narrator. There was no intermediary to kind of guide you through. And I think that was what was so different and profound about it. It was just the stories, and it was just the sharing, the fact that you and the people, like are the relatives who are actually in the documentary, are hearing some of these things for the very first time. And it creates almost like a situational intimacy. And again, I think this is probably different for Native people than it would for non-viewers, frankly. And maybe even different for those of us who have like the history of boarding school and residential school, either maybe one generation removed or maybe two. I think all three of us do, actually, who are in this, and we can talk a little more about that in our family histories. But it created, the outcome of this I wasn't sitting there immediately like analyzing the politics of trauma, as being portrayed in the documentary. I came out of that, and my very first impulse, and it's been a lasting impulse, was like, how can I better support those are people who have survived this? I feel like I understand this in a way, like you said this earlier, Rochelle. I fully understand this in a way because of this documentary that I have never understood it before, because of how this documentary was made about an extremely familiar, nay popular discourse at this point. Meaning like it's become mainstream to talk about the trauma, and I'll do more of a breakdown of that word later on, hopefully. around boarding school and residential school experience. Like everyone knows that these institutions existed. Everyone knows about the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. We now have like a federal boarding school initiative that was established by the Department of the Interior under Deb Haaland's leadership, a few years ago during the Biden administration. So everyone knows about this, but it's like this documentary helped me not just know it analytically or factually or statistically. I felt it deep in my soul, perhaps for the very first time. Even though like I have most of my relatives went to boarding school from that generation. And that led me to a very different place. And it just felt so much more I feel like we get an unadulterated, like Indigenous truth telling in this documentary that isn't filtered through like the bullshit state-centered discourse of reconciliation. Because these days you can't talk about truth without also reconciliation. They're paired together now because of the way the Canadian state, has framed that project. And this documentary was like, the reconciliation piece was like out of frame the whole time. And this was true. And what was even more wild about it, if I can talk a bit more, is that this is happening like a year ago. They filmed this in the immediate aftermath of the revelation that was in 2022. In May of 2022, those mass graves of First Nations children were discovered at Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. And so this documentary is starting like, from what I can tell, the timeline is like right after that, and gives you an insider understanding of what's happening on the ground in these First Nations communities where these Catholic residential schools have this long legacy of horrific violence. Violence doesn't even begin to describe the pain and the depravity of these institutions and their effect on these communities. And so it is wild, right? You're like almost 20 years into the so-called Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada, and the truth part is still completely silenced. It still hasn't come out for some of these communities, because this is something that's being filmed between about 2022 to 2023, I would say, probably when they were on the ground filming this. And you can tell that this is like the first time that some of these folks are saying these things out loud, and certainly the first time they'd be saying them in front of a camera. So like, reconciliation is complete bullshit. Now that I've had a bit of distance, analytical and political distance, like I'm not even interested in that. There is so much more truth telling that needs to happen. And I think that this documentary demonstrates that, because we would not still be doing this in the year 2022 and 2023, if that wasn't the case. And that is the Indigenous perspective on this issue and on this legacy and in this history. And like, however long that needs to continue, like we should be there for it, right? We should be in solidarity with those survivors and their families and the intergenerational impact of residential schools. And like, reconciliation can happen on Indigenous terms whenever that has come. But that is something, almost like this documentary, what's the word I'm trying to use? Like in terms of like time and temporality, it took us back to before the nonsense of Truth and Reconciliation. And it like restarted the clock in a way for me in my mind. And it was really like so truly profound. I'm having actually a hard time finding words to describe it.
Yeah, we've talked about reconciliation before and under about different topics. And reconciliation is dead. And I think now with this film, we're entering into a new era. Reconciliation is not an option anymore. Now it's time for restitution and retribution. And I just don't see how anyone in BC could accept reconciliation with an apology from either the Pope as a representative of the Catholic Church or Justin Trudeau as a representative of the Canadian government. Like, that is, and I said this before, that is not enough. There needs to be restitution. There needs to be some kind of retribution. And I don't know what that would look like. Anyone who's listened to this podcast before knows how I feel about the Catholic Church, and I understand, in my mind, as I was thinking about these residential schools run by the Catholic Church and the sexual abuse that took place, in my mind, I understood that children might be pregnancy and children might be a result of this sexual abuse. And so as a mother myself, that was a horrific concept that these young children, young women would have been impregnated through rape and had their children taken away from them. And that's hard enough to conceive of. But what this film, brought to the forefront was that these children were not taken away and given up for adoption. Sorry, that to me, like, that was one of the places I just had to get up and walk away. I was like, wow. I mean, and the fact, and I have no respect, I have no even understanding of these nuns, priests, lay people attached to the Catholic Church, but that a nun, a woman, could take a brand newborn child and throw it into an incinerator just like stopped me cold. I didn't know what to do. And I think I got up, I had to walk outside, I had to say a prayer. It was unbelievable. And what Melanie said, yeah, all respect, all support, everything to the people who are dealing with this. It's frankly unconscionable that the Catholic Church still stands, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that very emotional piece, because that's one of the things that I think also ties to what Melanie was sharing about it feeling just like you were in the experience with them. One of the things that this could only be made by an Indigenous person from their community. And one of the parts that really stuck out to me was when Julian's auntie brings him to the barn where there's all those etch marks of the children's names. And this happens several times throughout the film where there's a ceremony performed. And, for folks that don't come from a practice of having ceremony around things, I think ultimately for me, what ceremony's done for my life, it allows you to be in life's most intense moments, whether it's trauma or love or deep interpersonal change, whatever it is, you're sinking into those moments and the people around you are acknowledging them in a deep way and you feel seen. And then you move on with the rest of how you relate to life in the community after that ceremony. And there's several moments throughout this film where there are songs sang and there's ceremony performed. And that I think that really kind of dropped me in to what you have to do to be able to do this work, to be able to talk about these things. And I actually wrote down the quote because I just thought it was so beautiful. It was when Julian's auntie or relative brings him to the barn. There's all those etch marks with the children's names. And he shared in the interview too that this actually wasn't planned. He didn't know this was going to happen. The auntie reached out to Emily and said, meet me in the barn at this time with the camera. You're going to want to film this. And so Julian didn't know this was about to happen, but they're standing up there and she faces him and she says, open your eyes, ears, and heart in this barn where they were strung up to these poles and lashed until they passed out. And she's crying at this point, of course. And she says, your elders are now looking to you to tell our stories you're going to make sure they're held accountable for everything they've done to us. And I really admire Julian's work with this film because I feel like there is a special place that, you know, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of boarding school survivors hold, where we don't have the embodied immediate trauma, but we also have seen how our relatives have suffered, and we want to bring those truths and stories. And, you know, a lot of in Red Nation, we always bring it back to colonization and the politics, and that's really important frameworks to understand. And I respect how Julian took that up and took on that responsibility and went into this project. And you can see how much it meant to the people by that ceremony that his auntie held. So I thought that was a really powerful moment. And there's moments throughout where him and his dad are singing. And there's a really beautiful moment in the field where they're, I think they're facing the school, facing St. Joseph's. And, you know, on some of the, what you were mentioning, Elena, with that really horrific story of Ed Noisecat being the only survivor of the incinerator. And kind of how, you know, those 51 of the 93 potential burials were not associated with the cemetery. They were able to directly name that after their research. But I think part of the nuns being able to make that choice and the priests and being able to do that has to do with, it was never about educating children to assimilate them. It was always about erasure and taking the land, and then whoever survived would hopefully be assimilated enough to be productive members of capital and being able to do labor. I mean, I think boarding schools only ever taught to kids to do labor. I think they were often, like folks in my family were working fields. So it was never about actually providing a safe place for kids to learn whatever society was being built at that time. And that's a really clear thing, I think, to name. There's no question about why these schools. What kind of school has a graveyard in the first place? They weren't schools. They were, concentration camps for children. I mean, they were fed food with worms in them. It wasn't a place to serve. It wasn't a place to thrive. It really wasn't meant for many to survive. But the ones that did then would go and re-enter what was then society and have nowhere to go with their trauma, have nowhere to go within their families, and nowhere to go with whatever they were taught, like whatever labor they were taught. I feel like a part that was also very tender for me is when they're interviewing, it looks like 3 relatives on a bench. They're sitting outside a road, like a bus stop, and it's on the side of the road. And it looks like they probably just drove up and started talking to them and asked, oh, like, have you been to that school, or do you know anything about that school? And they're all very clearly under the influence of something. They're all drunk or on some kind of drug, and they'll say, oh yeah, we all went there. And then, in their very altered state, they like make some kind of sounds and maybe sing a little bit of a song. But, that's, there's people that are not able to sit with that trauma, and the only places they had to go, didn't bring them in. They weren't meant to be brought in and accepted and then have meaningful things to do with their lives. So, and I felt like those 3 relatives, I laughed along with their joy. They're like, but it was a very, well, I don't know if it was real joy. I laughed along with their laughs, and, I was mirroring the smiles on their faces, because that's how I experienced. That's what's so powerful about this film, is I'm like mirroring what's coming at me. But, they were clearly not well.
yeah, I remember that scene in the woman who was talking about how she was abused by one of the Catholic priests, and she went to the other priest and told him what was going on. Or she went to the nun. First, she went to the nun and she told her what was going on, and the nun said, "Go tell the other father." She went to tell him. He said, "Go tell the Indian agent." She told the Indian agent. He said, "Go tell your father." And she went and told her father, and she said, "My father beat the crap out of me." So I went and got drunk. I got a bottle of wine and got drunk, and that seems to be a a common enough reaction to that trauma, and has destroyed so many families, communities, and it's just one of the lasting legacies of settler colonialism and the Catholic Church that came along with it. Um, the the one person, the other person in the film, Rick Gilbert, he and his wife were trying to salvage relics from the burning of the churches that happened after Kamloops. Um, and he was obviously devout Catholic, and his wife was, and they were trying to save icons from the church. And you see his journey through his eyes as he finds out that I think his wife did the DNA for him, did a DNA test, sent it off to one of those places, and it comes back. It turns out that his DNA shows that he's half Irish, and that realization that he was fathered by the rape of his mother by one of the Catholic priests, and how he works through that and goes to the Vatican and stands before the Pope, um, and says apologies are not enough. It's just that hit hard to me, because I have family members who are devout Catholics, and I have never been able to understand it. I have never been able to stomach it, but um, that's their right, and I don't argue with it. But it was really poignant and touching to see him go through that journey, from where you see him at the beginning of the documentary, with his wife trying to salvage statues and things, till the very end when he's dressed up in his beautiful traditional regalia, standing, in the room with the Pope, who doesn't seem to know what to do with all these native people. And it's just, yeah, that was something else.
Yeah, one thing that really like immediately made me tear up is when he stands up, he gets his regalia or his shirt on, and he's wearing a necklace, and he flips over a rock that's a pendant and it says courage. And if I was like a white wooey person, I would think that that's like really cringe and cheesy, but I just instantly teared up because like what he was about to do and the journey that he went on, because they went to Italy, and there's even footage of him practicing Italian. And the amazing thing to me about this particular elder, and I wish I could remember his name for this moment, was how when the camera was put in front of him, he had no hesitation to share. And you can tell that he probably hadn't talked about this a lot in his life openly, but he's just loading up the car and then just mentions, like, he picks up this massive Bible that's like this thick. And he just said, he like looks at whoever's holding the camera and says, one of the things that they used to do if you spoke your native tongue or if you didn't listen in class or you messed up, that they would make you go and sit in the corner and hold that massive Bible above your head for an hour. And then he even adds the line, can you imagine being 7 years old and holding something like this above your head? And to be speaking that and remembering it and having the visual memory as you're like moving a big Bible, and then just him flipping over that little pendant that said courage. I'm like, we are so lucky that we're along the journey with this person. Like, this was like pure internal trauma and processing, like in real time, that there's like a pure, I can't describe it, there's also like a pureness to him too. And there, another moment that got me is when he's on the bus and all of these indigenous people, they're in Italy, they're on the way to the Vatican, and they're all co-relating about the horrors. And he's like, oh, do you know like Father McGraw or priest? Like they're all naming the priest because they all have similar stories. And a woman says like, oh yeah, one of the things is we're investigating the 2 or 3 boys that ran away and froze to death that were very young. And this elder is sitting there listening, and the camera pans, which we would not get in a podcast or in a research paper, to his fist. And as the woman is sharing, he's clenching his fists. And that's for him, that's how it manifests. Like, he's not raging on the people around him, but man, all that has to go somewhere. And so his story touched me like some of the deepest in watching this film. And he actually passed away. I think you saw it said in memory of, and I just think it's such a powerful thing that one of the last things he did in his life was he did that trip and said what he said.
Well, and I think that, you were saying, Rochelle, like these aren't schools. That's like a colonial euphemism for a death camp to destroy the future of Indigenous people. And those who did survive, who didn't end up in graves, expected to assimilate. That's what they were being, quote unquote, prepared for. But I don't even think they were being prepared for assimilation. They were just being tortured. And their spirits and bodies and minds were being completely destroyed. Like, is survival rate and having your newborn child incinerated by the Catholic Church, is that better than dying? Sorry, I'm crying. I don't think so. Is being like so broken and having no recourse because every single person in your family also went through the exact same thing. Like, is that better than dying? Like, I don't know. And I think even though I used the word shame earlier, when I was talking about how much courage it must have taken for Julian to share his family story and his father. But I actually don't think it's shame. I think the words you use were suffering. I think suffering and pain, it must have been all of these people. I remember the elder, she was in a wheelchair. They wheeled her out to the field. She had a disability, and the inference was that like some of her issues stemmed possibly from the abuse that she endured at that residential school. And that word tenderness that you used earlier, that was the feeling. I had so much tenderness when the pain, especially of these elders, because they're so like pure. You're using the right word. I also thought the same word, pure. And it was like a Rick passing away right after this documentary was, I don't know if after it was completed or after it was released. And you also find out that he's a former chief of Williams Lake First Nation. And so he's like a very important person, in the history of that nation, and leader. He's considered a leader, even though he has this history that he shares with all of these other people in his community. And all of them, I don't know, like all of them sharing these stories on camera and like that courage to do so. There's that traverses through the suffering and the pain that also makes me very emotional, because I'm like, holy shit, like this entire community was destroyed. Or they attempted, this one school attempted to destroy this entire community, because that's what those were about. They're about destroying us. Yet you have the people who did survive, who are now elders. Even now, they're just like telling us the story. They're piercing the veil. And your reconciliation is dead. Like, reconciliation is dead. They're not interested in reconciliation. They're interested in justice. And even after all of that, and all of the pain and the suffering that they have embodied, that has settled into their souls and their spirits, you know, the ones who are still alive, like they're still able to do this. Like Chief Gilbert is still able to go to the fucking Vatican and confront the Pope. The Catholic Church is one of the most powerful institutions in world history. Like they were going into the heart of empire, entering that space. And he, even though like we finally find out his story, he and all of these other people are willing and like have so much bravery. They're like such warriors, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm just like circling around trying to find words. But all of that pain and suffering, and still are warriors. And like, even though there is so much suicide, there are a lot of stories about people who killed themselves, you know, who could not endure the addiction, the alcoholism, you know, like those 3 relatives on the bench, as you were referencing, Shelly. Yes, there's all of those people throughout the documentary, but there's also this kind of like class of warriors who are just like, it's been all this time. We've gone through this process of quote unquote truth and reconciliation. But here today, we're going to set the record straight. And from this point forward, that's what I was trying to say earlier. We're going to restart the clock on this shit. And from this point forward, there's going to be some justice. And that this is our moment to say this and to lay down this prayer. A prayer is way stronger than a vote. Okay, a prayer is way stronger than a fucking piece of legislation in my perspective. And I felt like this documentary was a prayer. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that this ended up being like Julian's community, you know, that Emily Cassie, you know, ended up focusing on. There was something very prophetic, I guess, about this documentary. And I was like getting, in addition to all of these other things that were going through my mind and my heart and my spirit, I had just like, it felt very yoded actually as I was watching it, because I was like, holy shit, this is a game changer. Like, there's something that this is punctuating that I couldn't quite name yet, but I was feeling it as I was watching it. And I think it's that. I think it's laying down a certain kind of prayer that is going to set us on a different collective trajectory of justice. I mean, and I'm like real justice, like accountability is the word his aunt used. Yeah, there ain't no going back. Like, you can't unbake the cake that was baked, you know, when this documentary was released. And so I guess just circling back, that it's that tenderness of just holding, like when someone discloses, especially like an elder discloses that kind of pain and suffering, there's a purity and an innocence in it. Also, when a child discloses that, and your responsibility is to like hold that and to honor it and to treat it with respect and delicacy. It's a delicate thing. It's very sacred. That pain and that suffering that was shared felt very sacred. And then, so you do that, or I was doing this as I was watching it. And then I was also in complete like awe at the courage that, even though there is this, that is complete, like that violence from that one residential school has infiltrated absolutely every aspect of this community. This is how like politics works, right? That even then they were still refusing, and they could still stand up all these years later in 2023, when everyone thinks that reconciliation is a foregone fucking conclusion, right? About residential schools. And that also made me cry. Like, I cried from the pain and the suffering and the stories, but I also cried from like the courage and the bravery. And I was like, this is Indigenous people right here. Like this is liberation. Like that's how it felt. It wasn't just about the trauma. It was also about that liberation, how liberating it must be to like tell that story and to say it so loudly and unapologetically. And I don't know if they'll ever know like how much they changed history, I think, by telling those stories, in addition to all of the survivors who've told those stories. And so it's hard to describe, like, again, like the level of impact this documentary had on me over anything else I have ever read about residential schools or boarding schools. Yeah, I have other things to say about other things, but I'll stop there right now.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I feel you articulated really well how that film made me feel, and just like I am super glad that that film, won a juried award at Sundance, and it is up for an Academy Award. Not because I care about those things, but because people need to see this film and they need to be exposed to the truth of it. It's and I think Rochelle said this. This is not reading a report. And when Deb Holland when the first report came out from the boarding schools south of the Medicine Line, you could read it. It was devastating. It was really dry. It was really, it's not the same thing. It's not as visceral as watching this and experiencing it through these people's eyes, through these people's pain. And yeah, reconciliation is way dead. And we've got to get to when I talk about retribution and restitution, I'm not talking about the courts, because most of these priests, and they interviewed or they tried to talk to a couple of them. They either are dead or dying, or in complete denial. So it's not about hauling these people before a colonial court, because that's never going to happen. This is about taking the Catholic Church, as Melanie just pointed out, one of the most powerful institutions in the world, in history, and making them pay restitution for what they have done. And this comes in the form of land back. This comes in the form of, medical care. This comes in the form of everything that they can do and pay without even taking a drop out of their bucket and giving it back to Native people and Native communities. And that's what needs to happen. Reconciliation isn't words on paper. Reconciliation is about making, and you said it, accountability. It's about making something right. And they're never going to be able to come close to a fraction of making it right. What they did to these children, from the sexual abuse, the rapes, forced pregnancies on children, and then what they did to those children's children. There is no reconciliation. There is no way they can come close to being held accountable for it. But I think there are some things that could be done.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not Catholic. Like, I don't think this can be fixed. Like, this is unforgivable.
Yeah.
Like the fact that this is a systemic, and it's not just with Indigenous children. Like, this is a systemic issue that is a part of the Catholic Church.
And these are the motherfuckers who invented hell. Like, this is where you're going. Do you know that?
Hope these motherfuckers are burning in hell. Like, there is nothing harder, I've been told by medicine people, when you do certain ceremonies. It's just you and the Creator looking back at each other. Those are the hardest ceremonies to do. you cannot lie in the face of that divine justice. I hope all of these motherfuckers are experiencing that in wherever place they go to, after they leave their bodies and move on in their journeys. Because there is no other form of earthly justice. There simply isn't for this, whatever this is. I could not even conceive of doing these things to another human being. And the fact that they just did this as like an everyday matter of course, like, how you're not human. Like, how could you possibly do this shit to thousands and thousands, millions of people across the world? Like, seriously, fuck you.
And the reason why we have so much rage right now, there's so much rage coming up in our bodies right now, because this is a direct extension of colonial logic. The belief that colonization is justified as this civilizing mission, which was part of the reading that we did last week with Amir Cesar. But the schools were, they were designed this way. They were designed to erase identity, to incarcerate children, and enforce submission in the most violent ways. And this is what's happening in Palestine. They're burning schools, hospitals, places of worship. Their children are incarcerated. There's, the destruction of their schools, hospitals, crops, their lifeways, their families are being separated. And this isn't some inevitable thing that happens when, and this was also in our reading, when civilizations come together. It does not have to be this way. This is out of colonization's drive for capital, to acquire land and labor and resources. It's that simple. And then from those places, this is all like, one of the things that just really, really tugged at my heartstrings in this film too, is the way that some of the elders were reflected. And you can tell that it's hard for them to sit with how much was lost. And it's not even just talking about the suffering. Of course, the suffering, immense, but also the immense of cultural loss and familial stories, and the ability to relate to each other in loving and healthy ways, the ability to access the land that's like held you and your family. Because I think, like, land back, I know that this gets thrown around, but it's also not just about, I don't know, some romanticized past. I don't think anyone on this call, but hopefully if this reaches anyone's ears, no one's trying to go back to the past. It's not about that. But there are different ways to move forward that we can collectively imagine. You gotta let Indigenous people be the ones leading those conversations. But one of the things I wanted to say was, when Julian's interviewing or just talking, they're not interviews like you were saying, they're just conversations in homes. And when he's sitting in his grandmother's home, when he's there with his dad, and they're having, it's kind of what could be one of the most climactic parts of the film. It's like they've been uncovering what happened to Ed, Noise Cat, and trying to piece, as part of their healing, wanting to piece some of that narrative together, kind of point blank, asking Ed's mom pretty directly what she remembers. And she can't quite fully name it outright, at least she didn't on camera. But she's in the moment. She's not denying the moment. And one of the things that she says is, there's so much more that I should have talked about. And Julian says, like what? Like, what things should you have talked about? And we never get the answer. They let us hang out in that moment for a few seconds, and then it moves on. But I think what's important is, in those places of silence, is what kind of is the loudest. And it's like she was able to pass on some of the language to Julian, which I thought that was a really beautiful part of the film too, him talking about returning throughout his life. And when I actually got to talk to one of my uncles, and my mom's side is Salish, they're Cowichan, they're indigenous to Vancouver Island. So, the closest boarding school was Cooper Island, which is now Penellicut Island. it was a Cooper Island residential school, and I actually thought my family must have gone there. But when I interviewed my great uncle and great auntie, I found out that my great grandfather was actually sent to what was called Quetzalita, which is in the interior of BC. It was about 80 miles away from Quamachin, the Quamachin village. And that was as a crow flies. So who knows how long it took to get there. They had to cross the Georgia Strait. And my aunt was also sent all the way to Albany. But anyway, my uncle didn't grow up learning the language, or I mean, that was his father directly said, I'm not teaching any of the kids our language because of what he went through. He was like, there's no way, we're not speaking the language here. And it wasn't until my great uncle grew up and was well into his adult life that he came back and learned songs in the language. And I was able to, in the conversation, kind of reflect back to him, because he has a lot of shame around what he's lived with and how he thinks he should have done more in his life with the culture or whatever. And I was able to mirror to him, you know, when my mom was dying, he was able to be at her bedside singing songs, and he brought ceremony to us. And the thing that came up for him, which was similar to Julian's grandma, is he said, I love to sing the songs. I'm like proud to sing the songs in those moments. And then something that often follows is, what have I been doing my whole life? Why did it take me so long to learn these songs? Why did it take me so long? Because he's in his 80s. And you can tell. And then there's lots of long silences that hang in those moments. And I feel like it's in those silent moments where you're sitting with those difficult truths where ceremony comes in. And it's also when, as family members, descendants, and relatives that are 2 or 3 generations removed from the direct violence, that we have like a responsibility to talk about these things. And he said something like, it makes me happy. And then he went back, he's like, well, I'm not happy that it happened. And he said, it makes me happy that folks that are young like Julian are talking about these things, so nobody forgets what happened, because this is only the first step. After this, things have to change. And that elder who went to the Vatican said the same thing. He actually quoted the Bible back to the guy too. He said, the Bible says when there's a wrongdoing that you're supposed to first acknowledge, and then second, there's action. He's like, and we've heard apologies, but nothing's changed. But there's a lot that comes up watching this film, because it reminds me so much of my aunts and uncles and how they've shared stories and what is said and what's not said and the things that were lost.
Yeah, he said Rick Gilbert, who is the guy, he when he quotes the Bible when he's at the Vatican, he said the Bible says words are the first step. And I think words are the first step, but this film is owning the words. And instead of starting with the apology from the Pope or the apology from Justin Trudeau, these are the words that came from the elders. These are the words that came from the people who lived through it. These are the survivors of this genocide. And, the genocide that is ongoing across the world right now. In Rochelle, you brought up Palestine, and that's just one ongoing genocide that is happening across the world because of imperialism, because of settler colonialism, because of capitalism. And we're in the fires of hell right now in this country, and these words are so important to hear, because once again, we are having to survive yet another genocide. And our ancestors did it and continue to inspire our struggles for liberation, our struggles against these colonial projects, this capitalist system, which is destroying our Mother Earth and all of our relatives. And so, in a weird way, this film gave me hope, because for a change, and I've watched a lot of these films about boarding schools, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and I've read a lot of reports, but this light on this community, the spotlight on this community was created by the community themselves, by the chief, by the women who were out there with the ground penetrating radar, by Rick Gilbert and his journey. That was the light that was shown on this, and the words are owned by that community. So it's not through someone else's. And Melanie and I've talked a lot about this. Like, we have to be the ones to tell our stories. We have to be the ones to own those stories and pass them down. So even in the midst of the hellscape that we're in right now, these stories are shining, and these words are being held up into the light of day. And that's really important. I didn't think I could ever be surprised at the depravity and the horror and the violence of the Catholic Church. And this film surprised me. And I'm grateful for it, as much as it sends me off. You know, I am grateful for those words. I'm grateful for that spotlight, because now I know. And we have to be able to show these events in order to get past them, to move on, and to start to heal. And this film was amazing, and it in a weird way it made me feel good.
It definitely felt like it released something, or it's like it redirected something that's kind of like stopped up or dammed up that I didn't even know was stagnant in that way. And it's like when a river is undammed is kind of how it felt. And yeah, that river's flowing now, and that river of justice, that's a lame metaphor, but that's kind of how it feels to me. And that feeling good, I just feel like a release, I guess, because of it, or having watched it. And again, a release I didn't even know I was holding inside. And that's, I think, also another profound thing. Yeah, thanks for Shelly for naming, like, the reason why our rage is blowing up is because of colonialism, right? I don't know anything about Catholicism as a religion. I don't care. I'm not Christian. I never will be. And I don't really care what religion people have. I'm not interested in like discriminating against people for their religious or spiritual beliefs, whether they're Catholic or otherwise. When I name the Catholic Church, I'm naming, the institution that was essentially the commander of colonialism in the Americas, in the tricontinental, right? In the global South. The Catholic Church and the way in which Christianity has been utilized to justify colonial violence and genocide, whether it's through the doctrine of discovery, which the Pope also apologized for, or manifest destiny, that, like, the way in which Judeo-Christian religions in particular have been utilized in service of imperial and colonial conquest. Like, that's what pisses me off. And that is what the source of the rage. And I think that this kind of, even like the sexual abuse that's very prevalent with the Catholic Church, has something to do definitely with, like, the soul of that institution is, like, cannot be repaired because it is so deep into the colonial and the imperial project globally. Like it cannot separate itself from that at all. And perhaps the religion, actually, the formal religion can't either. And so, like, that I think should just be said out loud, that it's not about religion. Just as like the genocide in Gaza has nothing to do, it's not a religious war. And though folks try to frame it that way, um, it's just about colonialism and it's just about imperialism. And that shit should just end wherever it's touched down on earth. Like, those colonialism and imperialism are like indefensible projects, period. And we should stop them in their tracks wherever they're rearing their ugly heads, whether it's the genocide, the mass killing of children in Gaza, or the mass killing of Indigenous children in residential schools. And yeah, whoever is pioneering or stewarding or, administering colonialism, which is, I mean, the Catholic Church did all three, that is what I'm naming. And that's the source of, not the source, well, that's the source of my rage, but that's where my rage is directed. And all of those nuns and priests who are like the foot soldiers of that colonial project, knowingly and willingly actually engaging in that, I don't think that's forgivable. And that's their problem. That's the Catholic Church's problem. That should not be anyone else's problem, particularly those who survived the coloniality of that particular institution. So I just wanted to add that and say that. I did want to give, we're probably approaching time here. I did want to give a shout out to, gosh, what was her name? She's leading the effort to do the radar surveying. So of the grounds, the graveyard, and the grounds of the residential school in what is the name of that residential school in Williams Lake? This is the residential, that's the topic.
St. Joseph's.
St. Joseph's. I also had, this was another thing that was really remarkable about the documentary, but I had no idea, especially, well, maybe this was happening before the international story broke about the discovery of these mass graves at Kamloops in BC. But I had no idea that each of these First Nations governments were funding and were funding these projects or these teams of researchers who in each of these communities at each of these residential schools were doing the exact same kind of surveying work to try to figure out, if there were unmarked graves, like how many that there were. Could we cross-reference that with the names of like kids or students, not students, the names of children who are in registers, right? And so they're doing this really meticulous, difficult, deep research to try to find out how many of these graves exist, how many of these young children appeared, and who they might have been, through going into archives, through doing like surveying in the land, through the like stories and having conversations with families. And then to see them, they were presenting the findings, their preliminary findings to the community. I had no idea that was actually happening on the ground. And I have no doubt it's happening in hundreds of First Nations communities in Canada. And that also was such a remarkable story, and also incredibly brave, but just the amount of work and care that was, I think, like just exposed or shared in this documentary. It was like the inside story almost of what was happening in the aftermath of that revelation about the graves at Kamloops. That was really remarkable. That again can't be conveyed by a CBC news story, or like an academic paper or a federal boarding school report about this topic. Well, is there any last things that either of you would like to share before we close it out?
Just grateful to all of those brave people who spoke their truth, and watching that movie actually made me understand my family a little bit more, for which I'm grateful.
Yeah, it might be. I was going to read this quote from Charlene, who's one of the women on that team that were leading that. And she said, "My name is Charlene, and like the rest of you here, I don't want to live with that anger and rage from residential schools. They can either work cooperatively with us, or, we're considering legal action." And someone says, "So you'll take him to court?" And she says, "Yeah, our community has been just screwed over by everybody. We're not going through it again. I don't give a shit about the government or whoever. You're going to goddamn well be accountable, and we're going to start now." And I feel like that was a sentiment of this film. And I thought it was really powerful too that a lot of those efforts were led by the aunties and the grandmas. And just want to quickly name, not directly, but just say, I got to talk to my great uncle and auntie from Cowichan, and they shared some of their stories. And one thing my aunt said, she's heard of this film, but she hasn't seen it yet. And she asked me, "Did you watch it?" And I said, "Yeah, I watched it." And she said, "Well, we all suffered the same thing. Whatever you watched in that film, that's what happened to us." And I was just great. We had a longer conversation, of course, but that stood out to me because it shows you how powerful this film is. So thank you to Julian and Emily, Ed, Grandma, Charlene, all the people that came forward and were so giving with their process and stories. And thank you both for having me on.
Absolutely. And my heart and prayer go out to all of those relatives in the documentary. I don't use the word healing very often. I'm using it from like a ceremonial kind of spiritual sense, but I truly pray for your healing and for all of our people. And I also pray for justice, like real justice and real accountability. But yeah, I hold your stories with the utmost respect and tenderness in my heart and in my spirit. And yeah, carry those forward, and it will forever change me and how I do the work that I do and how I move through the world and who I am as a relative to other Indigenous people. So yeah, for that very like difficult but beautiful lesson. Thanks everyone. I think this is the first time I've cried on this podcast. Actually, I don't think I've ever cried on RPH before.
Yep, it's first for me too. We're usually mad, right?
We're laughing. I've known both your laughs so well.
We're laughing. Yeah.
Like
yeah.
mad or like irreverent. Usually mad or irreverent, I think, are two things that are pretty common.
Righteous joy and righteous anger.
Yeah. And sometimes we laugh because otherwise we'd cry. This time there was no substitute. This time there just was no way. And I think about, next time I dance, I'm going to be, little part of me is going to be dancing on the graves of all of those nuns and priests, and just knowing that their own belief system has them burning, 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 burning.
That can be the title of the podcast. Burning, 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 burning. You can do the 3 burnings in ellipses and then burning.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Again, please consider joining becoming a patron on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. And if you have not had a chance to check out our GoFundMe, we're trying to get about another $1,800 by the end of February, which is in 5 days. So please consider donating. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
Let's go.